Part 25. When the Terminator had been struck by the tanker, it bounced up under the cab and shot an arm onto the lower hanging exhaust pipe, then was dragged along for a moment before letting go. It aimed itself strategically and correctly estimated the bounce angle. When it ricocheted underneath the truck, it grabbed the driveshaft casing, and hand over hand, the man-machine made its way back towards the connecting disc behind the cab. But the truck suddenly braked, and the momentum caused an error in calculating the next outreach. The Terminator was torn loose, bounced back, smacked the bottom of the first tanker, and then rolled to a stop near the rear trailer's tyres. It immediately crawled out and surveyed the vehicle. Considering its options, it decided to commandeer the truck to continue the pursuit. As it started forward, its internal screen displayed damage reports. Backups started kicking into the battered hydraulics, but nothing could be done about the pivot joint in the left ankle. It was mainframe damage that would require full attention, later, if necessary. But actually, all it did was cause the machine to limp. And it could no longer sprint up to 22 miles an hour. But it could walk. As it came around the last tank trailer, it collided and immediately terminated the driver. The Terminator's powerful fingers tore out the man's throat, then started for the cab, letting the limp body melt onto the pavement like a mass of jello and broken sticks. The partner had been sitting on the passenger side in the cab, trembling with shock. The horror of what had happened was only just beginning to sink in when a grisly apparition opened the opposite door and sat behind the wheel. The partner shrank back at what he saw, the face gouged open by the road, flesh hanging down in a raw flap, a torn open eye socket with something demonically glowing inside, like an alien eye, a blood-pulsing slash along the powerful arm. It stared down at the controls in the dash and seemed to be thinking about them. Then it looked up and into Wayne's eyes and spoke. "Get out." He didn't have to be asked twice. He bashed his door open and leaped to the pavement, cracking his shin, then ran, limping, as fast as he could go away from the dead thing that they had killed and that had stared him in the face. The Terminator scanned the layout of controls in the big cab, cross-referencing with memory on the make of the truck, shift pattern, transmission configuration, and engine specifications. When its bloody fingers closed over the shift knob, it felt the massive transport machine as if it were an extension of itself. It shifted into low second and let out the clutch. The Terminator spun the wheel and gunned the diesel engine. Slowly, the tanker lumbered in a wide circle. The machines were coming back to Sarah. Sarah came up from claustrophobic semi-consciousness. When she fought for a breath and began to see images, the world came back to her in slashes of light and intermittent flaps of reality. They were upside down in the cab, lying on the roof, staring up at the pedals. Reese was under her, limp and still. She tried to get off him, but their legs were entangled. Finally, she got clear and looked back at him. There was new blood on his chest and his arm. His face was like milk, and his eyes had dark circles under them. A slight blue tinge began to hue his pallor, and she realized, in a shock, that he must not be breathing. She grabbed his collar and shook him. "Reese!" A black void opened up before her as she saw him being slowly torn out of her life. She tried to pull him back from the brink, to drag his lifeless being back into existence. She kissed his face, she wept, she coddled, and she urged sweetly. Then finally, reaching a pragmatic behavior by default, blew air into his lungs. She noticed how it bubbled in red froth out of a hole in his chest. Instinctively, she slapped her palm over it and continued. He coughed and opened his eyes. Raising a bloody hand, Reese weakly pushed her back, trying to rise, trying to protect her, to continue the mission. It would be okay if he could. He fell back, gasping. Then Sarah looked up and saw the Terminator killed. She watched the tanker slide to a halt about 75 yards down the road and squinted as the driver stepped down and walked to the rear of his truck. She gasped as a shadowy figure limped into the pool of streetlight and murdered him, and blinked with incomprehension as the thing calmly looked towards her, then to the cab, got in, and began making the long, slow death arc back towards her. The truck ground through 3 gears, lurching up to 48 miles an hour, then veered into the divider fence, smashing it flat and thundering across into Sarah's side of the freeway. The nightmare wasn't going to end. Instead, the nightmare had swollen to the size of a tanker truck, its headlights stretching out, licking at the overturned Bronco, bleaching the interior, growing brighter by the second, its engines rattling the night. Sarah snapped into action, kicking the bent door open and yanking on Reese's body, trying to get them both out of the cab before the truck flattened it. But Reese was hanging on to the rim of life by his fingernails and needed every ounce of strength to stay there. He couldn't help her at all. Sarah grunted and then came out of the Bronco and slipped her arms under Reese's. He was so heavy. The headlights bored into her and the engine screamed mortality. She was blinded and her ears rang. She couldn't see Reese. She couldn't hear her own scream. She could only feel him in her arms. She pulled. His leg was caught. That was the problem. Somewhere in the cab, Reese's leg was caught. She turned his body and his leg came loose, but now the truck was so near. She could feel its thunder, and she looked away so that the only sign it made in her head was the 2 suns glowing onto the pavement behind her. Sarah was out of breath and strength. Gravity did the rest. She fell backwards into the street as the tanker struck the Bronco. Metal slammed metal, and rigid steel was instantly ripped and crushed into new shapes. There was no explosion, just sound. A thunderous crash and screech as the Bronco folded across the front of the tanker's grille, hesitated as long as the laws of energy conservation allowed, then rebounded into the air just as Sarah fell back, and Reese's legs cleared the cab. A moment later, the Terminator locked the brakes and the tanker backed up on itself, the full load of petroleum compressing into the forward sections of the tankers, bulging the metal there. The Bronco had been blasted into a high arc, and when it came back to Earth, it flipped 4 times, then rocked on its side and lay still. In an instant, it had graduated from vehicle to modern sculpture. Sarah looked back as the big truck lurched to a stop and then turned. The headlights were crawling across the landscape, spinning around, searching for her. She heaved Reese to his feet in one exhausting pull. He was murmuring something in her ear. "Go on, without me. Go on." She slapped his face, hard. It was a reflex. Everything she was doing was reflex now, because most of her had been put on hold. The little Sarahs had nothing to say. They'd been ripped and thrown away. She struck Reese again. His eyelids snapped up. The stinging pain cut through the dull ache in his chest and arm. There seemed to be 2 5-ton weights in his body, and he could barely move. But when Sarah slapped him, he could put all of that into perspective, focus on her face, see the headlights reflected in them simultaneously with the fear, know that she was going to die, unless he came with her. And since he did not want her to die, Reese took a step. It was a major triumph, but it was all out of scale with the juggernaut bearing down on them. 1 step was a drop in the bucket. They had to run. Sarah threw his arm around her shoulder and they began to move. The truck was gaining speed, roaring on. Reese was searching for some reserve strength to get his legs moving. He thought of Sarah dead and bleeding, and found it. They ran. Slow, uneven strides, but better than walking, and certainly better than shuffling. But the truck went into 4th gear, engine racing, hitting 48 miles an hour. Inside the cab, the Terminator estimated point of contact in 8 seconds. But Sarah was pulling Reese down the side of the freeway towards the border fence. The Terminator made adjustments in contact estimation. It yanked the wheel and then squealed into another arc, now assuming point of contact at 9 seconds. Sarah saw the rig bouncing over the edge of the freeway and thundering down the ivy-encrusted slope towards them. She heaved Reese up over the fence, all but flinging him into the bushes on the other side. The headlights lighted the way ahead, tantalizing and mocking as they closed on the pair. But Sarah was now leaping the fence and pulling Reese to his feet. The Terminator lost traction and the truck began to slip on the wet ivy. It crashed through the border fence about 4 feet away from Sarah and Reese. The truck crashed through the chain link fence and tore through bushes, then rolled onto a residential street. By the time the Terminator got the transmission back into first and was gunning the truck around, Sarah and Reese were about 50 yards ahead, running into a parking lot. The Terminator and the truck gained speed, sideswiping a row of parked cars. Sarah and Reese staggered and ran down the street towards the only cover nearby, an industrial park. As they were running down the driveway apron, they heard the bellowing engine of the Terminator's tanker truck not far behind. Reese knew his legs were giving out. He couldn't go much farther. His entire body was closing down for the winter, the long, cold winter. But before that happened, "Go ahead!" he yelled at Sarah. She shook her head violently until she saw the pipe bomb in his hand, and he brutally pushed her onward. She understood and acted, running on, moving more slowly into the middle of the lane between several parked cars. The truck rumbled after her. She could see Reese fling himself into a deep shadow, scrabble forward, and shove the bomb into the tailpipe of the passing tanker. The Terminator was shifting gears and highballing through a parked car only 40 yards behind her, rapidly closing the gap. Sarah dodged around a tree and broke into a leg-pounding run, springing all out, head tilted back, charging out of death's open jaws. But the truck was bearing down, splintering the tree, and howling pistons were screaming for her blood. She ran faster, 30 yards. She ran faster, 25 yards. Her legs were blurs. Her lungs were dying. 20. Sarah reached the corner of a building as a wave of light and heat flared behind her. She threw herself to the ground and rolled. Looking back, she saw the most beautiful destruction she could have ever imagined. A fireball grew from the tailpipe to the cab, rolling in bright yellow waves of superoxygenated gas, the liquid furiously releasing its energy. An ocean of flame enveloped the entire tanker truck, and it jumped forward into the air, angrily self-destructing at high speed. Sarah lay back behind the corner of the building as a concussive shockwave hit her like a slap, driving the breath out of her lungs. She could hear rending metal as the traumatized remains of the truck crashed back to the pavement and rolled to a stop. She had to see the thing frying in the wreckage, had to know it was finished, once and for all. She leaned out around the building. Flames surrounded the truck, geysering up in flicking sheets, blotting out the stars with thick clouds of roiling smoke. Something moved in the twisting cab. The Terminator. It pushed out of the bent debris, charred, misshapen, lunging down to the ground. It fell and rolled onto its back, a moving torch. Could it feel pain? Sarah shielded her face from the heat, looking through her fingers. Even at this distance, it was like looking into a steel smelter. The pavement was melting and bubbling around the burning wreckage, catching fire itself. The Terminator continued to crawl without apparent pain. It was tangled in the twisted debris, the hair and clothing already gone, and its remaining flesh sizzling like bacon on the griddle of its own superheated endoskeleton. Slowly, reluctantly, the thing in the flames stopped moving until only its head turned, locking into position so that its eyes were facing her. Even in death, it watched her. Sarah knew then that she would live out the rest of her days. She had survived, but that blackened skull of a face would haunt her every night of her life. She watched it burn for a long time until it was obscured by settling wreckage. A dim sense of triumph welled up, but was quickly extinguished when she remembered Reese. Scrambling to her feet, Sarah forgot about the Terminator burning in the debris. She staggered into the searing air, moving around the truck, trying to see past the flames to the dumpster on the far side. But the fire was in her way, and the heat was a physical wall she could not penetrate. Her face was stretching taut, baking off the moisture. "Reese!" Then she caught a glimpse through dying flames of the dumpster. Burning gas had made a finger of light to it, and now it was surrounded by smoke. Had Rhys gotten out? She needed to know if he was alive more powerfully than she wanted to live. She started to walk into the flames when Rhys called her name. He was there, lunging through a momentary pocket in the blaze, held back, as she had been, from breaking through. Now they came into each other's arms. There was smoke pouring off Rhys's clothes. Blood caked his skin. He groaned weakly when she embraced him, but she could not be gentle now. Her body was still reacting, almost of its own volition, crushing him to her breast, kissing his face, murmuring her love. They sagged to their knees on the pavement, locked in an embrace, before the raging truck's cyborg inferno. "We got it," Sarah said, rocking him now, making time slow down, closing off the heat with her body, protecting him now from the flames, from his own mortality, if possible, returning the favour of his love and protection. The lovers clung to each other, and so did not see the debris stir, did not notice the clang of metal as twisted steel was pushed out of the way, did not see the Terminator rising like a phoenix from the fire.